We are opening the cold case files on human ambition, a ledger written in wasted gold and unnecessary blood. This is the forensic breakdown of what happens when the ego of a leader overrides the fundamental laws of physics and biology. We aren't looking for excuses. We are looking at the evidence left behind when a project is doomed before the first stone is even laid. The world is littered with the skeletons of great ideas that were actually just expensive monuments to the refusal to admit a mistake. Number 1. In 1628, the Swedish warship Vasa was commissioned to be the most powerful naval weapon in the Baltic Sea, carrying 64 heavy bronze cannons. The king demanded an extra deck of guns be added midway through construction, despite the master shipbuilder's warnings that the vessel was becoming dangerously top-heavy. The result was a masterpiece of engineering that had the stability of a tall chair on a frozen lake during a gale. The smell of fresh tar and the sound of a cheering crowd that turned into a collective gasp as the ship tilted just slightly too far to the left. The Vasa sank 20 minutes into its maiden voyage, traveling less than a mile before the water rushed into the open gun ports and dragged it to the bottom. Because of this refusal to respect the center of gravity, the Swedish treasury was emptied for a wreck that stayed at the bottom of the harbor for 3 centuries. Number 2. At the turn of the 20th century, Fritz Haber discovered a way to pull nitrogen from the air to create synthetic fertilizer, a process that arguably saved 4 billion people from starvation. However, Haber used that same intellectual brilliance to develop chlorine gas. Personally overseeing its first successful use in the trenches of World War I, it is a paradox of a man who held the bread of life in one hand and a cylinder of agonizing death in the other. The sight of a lush green wheat field fueled by his chemistry contrasted with the yellow, suffocating cloud rolling across a Belgian battlefield. Because of this duality, the modern world exists in a state of constant growth, fueled by the same industrial processes that perfected mass destruction. Number 3. The Darien scheme was a 17th-century attempt by Scotland to establish a colony in the jungles of Panama to control trade between the Atlantic and Pacific. The planners failed to account for the fact that the land was a fever-ridden swamp filled with hostile Spanish forces and zero infrastructure. They invested nearly half of the entire national wealth of Scotland into a venture that resulted in a graveyard of thousands and total financial collapse. The sound of rain hitting a hollow, empty supply crate, and the sight of a colony that was nothing more than a collection of rotting wooden crosses. Because of this catastrophic failure of due diligence, Scotland was so bankrupt it was forced to sign the Acts of Union with England in 1707 just to survive. Number 4. In 1958, the Great Leap Forward in China included the 4 Pests campaign, which encouraged the total extermination of sparrows because they ate grain. The government failed to realize that sparrows also ate locusts, and without the birds, the insect population exploded and decimated the country's entire food supply. It is the clinical definition of an ecological chain reaction triggered by a complete lack of basic biological understanding. The silence of a countryside without birdsong, followed by the deafening buzz of a locust swarm that covered the sun. Because of this forced imbalance of nature, the resulting Great Chinese Famine killed an estimated 15 to 55 million people. The evidence points to a recurring pathology, the belief that a high enough rank can override the basic laws of reality. When power meets a flawed blueprint, the result isn't just a mistake, it is a systematic liquidation of resources and lives. Number 5. In 1915, the British military launched the Gallipoli campaign, a plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by seizing a narrow peninsula. The planners utilized outdated maps and failed to account for the vertical cliffs that turned the landing beaches into a literal shooting gallery for the defenders. It was an attempt to run a high-speed naval assault through a needle-as eye while blindfolded and wearing lid boots. The metallic tang of sea salt mixed with the smell of iron from the thousands of bodies cooling in the surf. Because of this failure to recognize the topographical reality, over 500,000 men became casualties for a piece of land that stayed exactly where it started. Number 6. In 1967, the United States launched Project 100,000. A program designed to recruit men for the Vietnam War who had previously failed military entrance exams. The Pentagon marketed this as a social program to help the underprivileged, but the clinical reality was that it sent men with low cognitive scores into high-stress combat zones. The military failed to provide the specialized training promised, and these recruits suffered casualty rates 3 times higher than their peers. The sight of a confused young man holding a complex weapon system he had never been properly taught to maintain. Because of this cynical experiment in human logistics, thousands of lives were discarded to meet a quota that never should have existed. Number 7. In the 1920s, Henry Ford attempted to build Fordlandia, a massive rubber plantation and American-style town in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. He ignored the advice of local botanists and planted the rubber trees too close together, which allowed a specialized fungus to destroy the entire crop almost instantly. He also tried to force Midwestern work hours and a prohibition diet on local workers who were understandably uninterested in becoming American factory cogs. The sound of a steam whistle echoing through a jungle that was already busy reclaiming the abandoned, rusting machinery. Because of this refusal to adapt to a different climate and culture, Ford lost $20 million on a ghost town that stands today as a monument to industrial arrogance. Number 8. The Concorde was a feat of supersonic engineering that could cross the Atlantic in 3 hours, but it was a financial catastrophe from the day it was conceived. The manufacturers and governments involved realized early on that it was too loud, too thirsty, and too expensive to ever be profitable, but they kept funding it to save face. This gave birth to the Concorde fallacy, the psychological trap of continuing to invest in a losing project because you've already spent so much. The deafening roar of a sonic boom followed by the sight of a ledger sheet bleeding red ink in every direction. Because of this refusal to cut their losses, the project burned through billions of dollars for a service that only the ultra-rich could ever afford. The data suggests a lethal correlation between absolute authority and a complete disregard for environmental feedback. When the objective is ideological purity rather than functional utility, the failure is not a bug. It is a structural feature. Number 9. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union implemented the Virgin Lands Campaign, a massive plan to turn the dry steppes of Kazakhstan into a global breadbasket. The central planners ignored the soil science, which indicated that the region was prone to severe droughts and lacked the topsoil depth for intensive grain farming. They removed the natural grasses that held the earth together, effectively creating a man-made ecological disaster on a subcontinental scale. The sight of 1,000 tractors churning up dust that would eventually rise into black blizzards visible from space. Because of this refusal to acknowledge the limitations of the soil, millions of acres were rendered permanently infertile, and the Soviet food crisis only deepened. Number 10. In 1917, during the First World War, the French army launched the Nivelle offensive, with the absolute certainty that they would break the German lines in 48 hours. General Robert Nivelle promised his troops a scientific victory, but he ignored the fact that the Germans had retreated to the Hindenburg Line, a much stronger defensive position. When the attack stalled in the mud and barbed wire, he continued to order waves of men into a slaughterhouse for weeks without adjusting his strategy. The sound of thousands of French soldiers bleeding like sheep as they marched toward the front lines, signaling they knew they were being led to the butcher. Because of this refusal to accept the failure of the initial plan, the French army suffered nearly 200,000 casualties and collapsed into a massive, widespread mutiny. Number 11. The Lake Peigneur disaster in 1980 occurred because an oil rig crew accidentally drilled a small hole into a giant salt mine located directly beneath the lake. The engineers used the wrong coordinate system, turning a shallow lake into a giant, swirling whirlpool that swallowed the rig, 11 barges, and a local forest. It is a clinical example of how a decimal point error can fundamentally alter the geography of an entire region in a single afternoon. The terrifying roar of millions of gallons of water rushing into a subterranean cavern that was never meant to hold anything but air. Because of this failure to check the underlying maps, a freshwater lake was permanently transformed into a saltwater ecosystem, destroying the local industry. Number 12. In the late 19th century, the French attempt to build a canal in Panama failed because they tried to apply the same sea level design they used for the Suez Canal. They ignored the massive elevation changes of the Panamanian jungle and the reality of tropical diseases, losing over 20,000 workers to yellow fever and malaria. They treated the jungle as if it were a flat desert, spending nearly $300 million before the company went bankrupt, and the project was abandoned. The sight of rusting steam shovels being swallowed by vines and the endless rows of white crosses in the Monkey Hill Cemetery. Because of this refusal to adapt to the terrain, the French lost their investment and the United States was able to buy the rights for a fraction of the cost. The forensic record of the 20th century is punctuated by moments where the pursuit of a grand vision resulted in a total disconnect from the physical world. We see a pattern of ignoring localized data in favor of centralized theories that look perfect on paper but are lethal in practice. Number 13. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union adopted the theories of Trofim Lysenko, a biologist who rejected Mendelian genetics as a capitalist lie. Lysenko claimed that plants could be trained to grow in any climate and that acquired traits could be inherited, leading to the forced planting of crops in frozen, unsuitable soil. The government institutionalized a scientific falsehood and imprisoned any real scientist who dared to point out that seeds do not have political leanings. The sight of millions of acres of rotted wheat and the cold clinical reality of a famine that didn't have to happen. Because of this institutionalization of fake science, Soviet agriculture was set back by decades and millions of people perished from preventable starvation. Number 14. In the 1950s, the United States military carried out Project Sunshine, a study to determine the effects of radioactive fallout on the human body. The project leaders realized they needed young tissue for accurate data, so they began a clandestine program to collect the bones of deceased infants and children without parental consent. It was a cold, calculated decision to prioritize the data points of the atomic age over the most basic ethical standards of human civilization. The sterile atmosphere of a laboratory where the remains of anonymous children were incinerated to measure the concentration of strontium-90. Because of this total failure of medical ethics, the government permanently damaged public trust and laid the groundwork for decades of conspiracy and fear. Number 15. The Maginot Line was a massive, high-tech string of fortifications built by France in the 1930s to prevent a direct German invasion. The French military spent billions on the line but left the Ardennes forest weakly defended, believing the thick woods were impenetrable to modern tanks. They built a multi-billion-dollar shield that only covered half of their body, assuming the enemy would be polite enough to strike only where the armor was thickest. The sound of German panzers simply driving around the end of the line while the French soldiers waited inside their state-of-the-art bunkers for an attack that never came. Because of this failure to account for mobile warfare, France was conquered in 6 weeks, rendering the most expensive fortification in history completely useless. Number 16. In the 1970s, the Italian government approved the construction of the Geronimo chemical plant in the town of Seveso, despite numerous safety warnings. The plant was designed to produce pesticides, but a massive failure in the cooling system caused a pressure relief valve to blow, releasing a cloud of TCDD, one of the most toxic dioxins known to man. The company waited days to notify the public, while thousands of animals died and children began developing chlorogen, a disfiguring skin condition. The sight of a white cloud settling over a quiet neighborhood and the eerie silence of a town that had to be evacuated and scraped clean of its topsoil. Because of this failure to prioritize safety over production speed, the Seveso disaster became the catalyst for the European Union's strictest industrial safety regulations. The evidence is clear. When the human ego builds a monument, it is usually the surrounding environment that pays the price. The investigation reveals that the most catastrophic failures often occur when a project reaches a scale where it is considered too big to fail. At this stage, the momentum of the investment becomes a blindfold, preventing the leadership from seeing the cliff directly in front of them. Number 17. In the 1920s, Thomas Midgley Jr. was an engineer who solved the problem of engine knocking by adding tetrethyl lead to gasoline. He was fully aware of the toxicity of lead. He even took a leave of absence to recover from lead poisoning, but he marketed it as ethyl to hide the chemical reality from the public. He essentially poisoned the atmosphere of the entire planet to solve a minor mechanical noise in internal combustion engines. The sight of a scientist holding a press conference where he inhaled leaded fumes for 60 seconds to prove they were safe, while secretly dying from the exposure. Because of this decision to prioritize corporate profit over global health, every human being born in the mid-20th century suffered a measurable drop in IQ due to lead in the blood. Number 18. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union decided to divert the rivers that fed the Aral Sea, the fourth largest lake in the world, to irrigate cotton fields in the desert. The central planners knew the lake would eventually disappear, but they calculated that white gold was more valuable than a stable ancient ecosystem. It is a clinical example of a death by 1,000 cuts. where a massive natural resource was liquidated for short-term agricultural quotas. The sight of rusted fishing trawlers sitting in the middle of a salt-crusted desert, miles away from a shoreline that no longer exists. Because of this environmental mismanagement, the Aral Sea has shrunk to less than 10% of its original size, creating a toxic dust bowl that has ruined the health of millions. Number 19. The Tay Bridge disaster in 1879 occurred because the lead designer, Thomas Bouch, failed to account for wind loading in his calculations for a massive railway bridge. He used cast iron components that were riddled with defects and ignored reports from train drivers that the bridge was wobbling under the weight of passing cars. The bridge collapsed during a winter storm, plunging a passenger train into the icy waters of the River Tay and killing everyone on board. The terrifying sound of metal snapping like glass and the sight of a gaping hole in the tracks where a 3-mile-long bridge used to be. Because of this failure to respect the raw power of the wind, the bridge was rebuilt with a massive safety factor, and the era of Victorian engineering hubris came to a violent end. Number 20. In the 1970s, the Ford Motor Company produced the Pinto, a compact car with a fuel tank positioned behind the rear axle that could rupture and explode in low-speed rear-end collisions. Internal documents revealed that Ford performed a cost-benefit analysis and decided it was cheaper to pay out settlements for deaths and injuries than to spend $11 per car to fix the design. It is the coldest possible data point, the exact dollar value a corporation places on a human life to avoid a recall. The orange flare of a gas tank igniting in a parking lot and the clinical coldness of a memo that weighed lives against profit margins. Because of this refusal to fix a known mechanical flaw, the Ford Pinto became the ultimate symbol of corporate negligence and triggered a landmark shift in product liability law. The evidence confirms that when we treat human lives as a variable in an equation, the result is always a tragedy. The investigation concludes at the intersection of total collapse and the absolute refusal to turn back. This is the point where the blueprint is on fire, the foundation is crumbling, and the leadership is still ordering a new coat of gold leaf for the roof. Number 21. In the 1840s, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that childbed fever deaths plummeted if doctors simply washed their hands after performing autopsies. The medical establishment rejected his findings because they were offended by the suggestion that a gentleman's hands could be unclean or carry disease. They chose to preserve their social status and professional ego while thousands of women died in their wards from a preventable infection. The sterile biting scent of chlorine that could have saved an entire generation, ignored in favor of the familiar smell of rot and blood-stained aprons. Because of this refusal to accept a simple, life-saving truth, it took another 20 years and the work of Louis Pasteur for hand-washing to become a standard medical practice. Number 22. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union built the Woodpecker, a massive over-the-horizon radar system designed to detect incoming American nuclear missiles. The project cost twice as much as the Chernobyl nuclear plant and required its own dedicated power station. Yet it never functioned properly because of signal interference. The engineers knew the physics were flawed for the specific frequency they chose, but they continued to beam a persistent, clicking noise that disrupted radio stations worldwide. The sight of a 700-foot-tall wall of rusted steel and the sound of a rhythmic, mechanical thump that served as a multi-billion-dollar nuisance. Because of this refusal to admit the technology was obsolete, the Duga array stands as a skeletal ghost in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a monument to a radar that couldn't see. The marketing villain is the sunk cost, the psychological prison that tells us we must continue a failure simply because we have already suffered for it. The forensic evidence is undeniable. We are a species that would rather go down with the ship than admit we were the ones who steered it into the iceberg. The truth doesn't care about your budget, your timeline, or your legacy. The normies are leaving the museum now, comforted by the idea that these are just lessons from the past. But you can see the same patterns repeating in every boardroom, every laboratory, and every capital city on the planet. Watch the blueprints carefully, because the next hard-to-believe failure is currently being signed into existence. Would you like me to start a new series or deep dive into a specific era of failure? The case files reach their most terminal stage when the failure isn't just a mistake, but a total inversion of the intended outcome. We are looking at the evidence of solutions that became more dangerous than the problems they were originally designed to solve. Number 23. In the mid-20th century, The United States Forest Service adopted a policy of total fire suppression, believing that every forest fire was a disaster that had to be extinguished immediately. The policymakers ignored the ecological fact that forests evolved with fire and that small, natural burns clear out the fuel of dead wood and underbrush. They essentially created a giant continental-scale pressure cooker by refusing to let nature breathe. The smell of dry, sun-baked pine needles piling up into a waist-deep carpet of tinder that was just waiting for a single spark. Because of this refusal to allow natural cycles to occur, we now face mega fires that are so hot and so fast they can destroy entire towns and alter the weather itself. Number 24. In 1914, the British explorer Ernest Shackleton set out to cross Antarctica in a ship called the Endurance, despite warnings that the ice pack that year was unusually aggressive. The expedition's goal was a total failure. The ship was trapped in the ice before it even reached the continent and was eventually crushed like an eggshell. It is a clinical study in mission creep, where the desire to achieve a world first overrode the basic logistical reality of an impassable frozen ocean. The sound of the ship as hull groaning under the pressure of millions of tons of ice, and the sight of a crew standing on a drifting floe, watching their home disappear. Because of this failure to respect the seasonal ice cycles, the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition became a 2-year struggle for survival that achieved 0 of its original scientific goals. Number 25. In the 1960s, the French government built the Plan Molinex housing projects, massive concrete high-rises designed to be a utopian solution to urban sprawl. The planners utilized a Le Corbusier style of architecture that emphasized efficiency but completely ignored the human need for social connection and defensible space. They built machines for living that functioned more like vertical prisons, isolating residents and creating crime-ridden no-go zones within a decade. The sight of gray, monolithic towers rising out of the mud, disconnected from the life of the city by miles of empty asphalt. Because of this refusal to account for human psychology and urban design, the French government has spent the last 20 years and billions of euros tearing down the very buildings they once called the future. Number 26. In 1929, the Soviet Union introduced the Eternal Week, or the Neperyrivka, a 5-day continuous work week where every worker had a different day off. The goal was to keep the factories running 365 days a year, but the central planners failed to realize that people actually want to have the same day off as their family and friends. They destroyed the concept of the weekend and obliterated the social fabric of the country to increase industrial output by a theoretical few percent. The sight of a father going to work while his wife is coming home, and the silence of a playground that was never full because the children were on a different schedule. Because of this clinical obsession with machine-like efficiency, the experiment was a total failure, resulting in a collapse of morale and a massive spike in industrial accidents. The evidence is overwhelming. The most hard-to-believe failures occur when we try to force a complex living system into a rigid, geometric box. The investigative trail leads us to the dead end of industrial hubris, where the refusal to acknowledge a physical limitation results in a permanent scar on the landscape. We are looking at the data of projects that were kept on life support long after the brain was dead, simply because the paperwork was already filed. Number 27. In the 19th century, the British Empire built the Chignecto Ship Railway in Canada, a massive project designed to haul entire 2,000-ton ships across land on giant sets of parallel tracks. The engineers ignored the fact that the weight of the ships would crush the iron rails and that the tides in the Bay of Fundy made the logistics of lifting a vessel out of the water nearly impossible. It was a 19th century attempt to treat a massive wooden ship like a childish toy on a carpet, ignoring the physics of structural stress and friction. The sound of grinding metal and the sight of a massive stone dock standing in the middle of a field, waiting for a ship that would never arrive. Because of this refusal to accept that some things are too heavy to move across a meadow, the project was abandoned after millions were spent, leaving behind the bridge to nowhere. Number 28. In the 1950s, the Brazilian government decided to build a new capital city, Brasilia, from scratch in the middle of a desolate plateau to encourage order and progress. The planners designed the city in the shape of an airplane from a bird's eye view, but they forgot to make it walkable or habitable for actual human beings on the ground. They created a city of monumental distances and empty concrete plazas where you need a car just to buy a loaf of bread, effectively killing the street life they hoped to foster. The sight of a high-speed highway cutting through the heart of a residential zone and the silence of a city center that has no soul, because it was designed by a ruler, not a resident. Because of this clinical obsession with aesthetics over utility, Brasilia remains a sterile administrative hub that the majority of its population lives outside of in satellite cities. Number 29. In the 1890s, the South Sea bubble of the Victorian era was the bicycle craze, leading to the creation of the Simpson lever chain, which promised to make cyclists twice as fast. The inventor used a complex system of levers and chains that defied the laws of mechanical advantage, yet he convinced thousands of investors and professional racers that he had reinvented physics. It was a magical solution that added weight and friction while providing zero actual benefit, sold through pure marketing and the desperation to be the first to own the future. The sound of a heavy, over-engineered chain clanking against a frame and the sight of a racer pedaling twice as hard just to keep up with a standard bicycle. Because of this failure to understand basic leverage, the company collapsed within years, taking the life savings of thousands who believed in a mechanical impossibility. Number 30. In 1947, Howard Hughes built the H-4 Hercules, known as the Spruce Goose, the largest flying boat ever made, designed to transport troops during World War II. The war ended before it was finished, and the aircraft was made of birch wood because of wartime metal rations, making it a massive, fragile relic before it even touched the water. It was a project born of a billionaire's obsession that ignored the fact that the era of the flying boat was already being replaced by long-range land-based bombers. The sight of a plane as large as a football field taking off for exactly 1 minute, flying just 70 feet above the water before being tucked into a climate-controlled hangar forever. Because of this refusal to pivot as the world changed, the Spruce Goose became the most expensive 1-minute flight in the history of aviation. The evidence is clear: the larger the project, the more likely the architects are to ignore the reality of the ground beneath them. The forensic trail enters the realm of ideological blindness, where the data is clear. The physics are certain, but the human desire for a specific outcome creates a fatal reality distortion field. We are examining the point where leaders stopped looking at the terrain and started looking only at their own propaganda. Number 31. In the 1920s, a group of scientists and politicians in the United States promoted the St. Lawrence Seaway as a way to turn the Great Lakes into a Mediterranean-style trade hub. They ignored the geological reality of the Niagara Escarpment and the fact that the route would be frozen solid for 4 months of every year. They built a system of locks and channels that was already too small for the next generation of ocean-going vessels before the concrete had even finished curing. The sound of a massive hull scraping against a lock wall and the sight of a 1,000-foot freighter forced to turn back because the shortcut was a bottleneck. Because of this failure to account for the rapid evolution of maritime technology, the Seaway never reached its projected tonnage and remains a subsidized monument to a 19th-century dream. Number 32. In 1961, the United States carried out the Bay of Pigs invasion, a plan to overthrow the Cuban government using a small force of CIA-trained exiles. The planners assumed that a spontaneous popular uprising would occur the moment the first boot hit the sand, despite their own intelligence reports suggesting otherwise. They chose to land in a swampy area with no escape routes, effectively trapping their own assets in a geographic cage of their own making. The sight of a radio operator frantically calling for air support that would never come, while the beachhead was slowly surrounded by a superior force. Because of this refusal to distinguish between wishful thinking and actionable intelligence, the operation was a total disaster that pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war a year later. Number 33. The Centralia Mine. Fire in Pennsylvania began in 1962 when the town council decided to burn trash in an abandoned strip mine pit that was connected to a massive labyrinth of anthracite coal seams. The officials ignored the warnings that the fire could spread into the tunnels, assuming they could just put it out if it got too big. The fire moved underground, where it has been burning for over 60 years, turning the ground into a literal hellscape of toxic gas and collapsing sinkholes. The smell of sulfur rising through the cracks in the street and the sight of a ghost town where the ground beneath your feet is 800 degrees. Because of this one decision to treat a coal mine like a trash can, an entire zip code was erased from the map, and the fire is expected to burn for another 250 years. Number 34. In the 1970s, the Pinto of the sky was the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, an aircraft with a cargo door that opened outward to save space inside the fuselage. The engineers knew the locking mechanism was faulty and could fail under pressure. But they issued a gentleman's agreement to fix it rather than performing a full, expensive redesign. The result was a series of explosive decompressions that led to the deaths of hundreds of people as the floor of the plane collapsed, severing the flight control cables. The terrifying silence of a cockpit where the controls have gone dead and the sight of a cargo door falling through the clouds like a discarded piece of scrap metal. Because of this decision to prioritize a quick fix over structural integrity, the DC-10 became a pariah of the aviation industry and changed the way safety bulletins are enforced globally. The data confirms that the most expensive shortcut is always the one that ignores the laws of nature. The final entries in the ledger reveal the terminal stage of human error, the moment when we realize the impossible disaster was actually an inevitable mathematical certainty. We have reached the end of the forensic deep dive, where the arrogance of the design finally meets the cold, indifferent gravity of the consequence. Number 35. In the 1960s, the Pruitt-Ego housing complex in St. Louis was hailed as the future of urban living. 33 massive buildings designed to eliminate the chaos of the city. The planners utilized a purist architectural style that removed all communal spaces, ground-level shops, and green areas, creating a sterile environment that fostered isolation and crime. They treated human beings like data points in a computer model, assuming that a modern facade would automatically lead to a modern, orderly society. The sight of massive dynamite charges turning the future of living into a pile of dust and rubble just 20 years after the ribbon was cut. Because of this refusal to understand that a building is an ecosystem, not just a concrete box, the failure of Pruitt-Ego became the official death certificate of mid-century urban planning. Number 36. In the 1980s, the Challenger space shuttle disaster occurred because the management at NASA ignored the warnings from engineers about the O-rings in the solid rocket boosters. The data showed that the rubber rings would lose their elasticity in cold temperatures, and the launch morning was the coldest on record. The leadership was under intense political pressure to maintain a PR-friendly launch schedule and decided to override the technical evidence for the sake of the optics. The chilling sight of a plume of white smoke turning into a chaotic Y in the blue Florida sky, and the silence of a control room that knew exactly what had happened. Because of this decision to prioritize the schedule over the physics, 7 lives were lost and the entire space program was grounded for nearly 3 years. The ultimate marketing villain in these 22 cases is the narrative, the story we tell ourselves to justify the unjustifiable. We ignore the evidence because we are in love with the vision. We ignore the leaks because we already paid for the ship. We ignore the math because we want to believe in the miracle. The forensic analysis is complete. The results are consistent across every century and every industry. The world is not destroyed by villains. It is dismantled by experts who are too proud to say, "I was wrong." The case is closed, but the pattern remains. Watch the headlines, check the blueprints, and never trust a guarantee that ignores the laws of nature. Keep your eyes on the horizon. The next hard-to-believe failure is likely already in its second phase of construction.